Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to week number 9. If you've made it this far, you are doing really well. So, today I want to talk to you first of all about internal structure in poetry because that's what we're going to be thinking about in this week's discussion board topic. If you want to follow along with me, you can go to content and then to course documents, and then to internal structure in poetry. So any writer who is skilled, whether he or she is writing a novel or a short story or a poem or whatever it might be, will understand the importance of choosing and arranging words in order to create the best interpretation of the meaning, and also visual and oral effects, because we want to think about what the words look like on the page and also how they sound. Poems are really made to be read aloud. So in poetry especially, because they're shorter works, just like a song lyric, which is just a poem set to music, individual words exist not just within phrases and patterns of rhythm, but also within sort of a larger organic wholeness of that poem. And so a skilled writer is going to ask himself or herself, how can I best organize this work? What needs to come first? What should come last? And what is the overall effect of that arrangement that I'm creating? So that arrangement of wording, along with elements like the tone, and when you think about tone, think about how the piece is making me feel as I'm reading it. So am I feeling sad? Am I feeling happy? Is the writer coming across to me as sarcastic or angry? What's the tone? The speaker, we've talked about that before. So who is speaking? What do I know about that speaker? The situation and the setting, the theme, the real underlying meaning of the poem, diction, word choices, the imagery being created, and the sound. All of that together is what we call internal structure or internal form in a poem. So remember, there are various genres, fancy word for types or kinds of poems. So we said this before, it might be a narrative poem, a poem that's focusing on telling a story. It might be a dramatic poem, so a poem concentrating on dialogue or maybe presenting a scene or a series of scenes. Could be a poem of contrast, so we're maybe presented with opposing or contrasting views or subject matters. It could be a lyric or lyrical poem, so a poem that's descriptive and characterized by emotion and ideas and the poet's state of mind. Or it could be a poem that centers on a shift in tone or subject matter. So maybe the poem's going along and all of a sudden, boom, there's this hard shift in the tone or in the topic of the poem even. The poem can be a hybrid. It could even consist of several of these characteristics coming together. So it might be a lyrical poem that has a shift. It might be a dramatic poem that is also a poem of contrast. And poems can often be divided into internal parts that are distinguished from each other by one of those kinds of shifts. So maybe a shift in subject matter, tone, address. So maybe first we have one speaker and then we have another speaker. Or maybe the speaker's talking to one person in the first part of the poem and to someone else in the last part of the poem. Could be a shift in tense. So maybe at first the poem is in first person, like using I'm speaking to you. Then maybe the tense shifts to third person. It could be a shift in mode. So a shift maybe from storytelling to a reflection or a description or something of that nature. Shifts can occur between stanzas. That's most often how they will occur. But they can also occur within the same line or even within a sentence. So interestingly, some poems do not contain any shifts whatsoever, and thus they don't seem to have distinctive parts at all that we can categorize in that way. But nevertheless, they're still organized in order to determine how the poem moves. if you will. So, for example, in Whitman's famous I Hear America Singing, there's no distinct shift within the work, but the way it is structured internally mimics and reveals its main theme, because the poem is structured like one long sentence in one big long stanza that refers to all these different kinds of people and their songs. But together, all of those different people singing their unique songs make up America. So the structure of the poem internally mimics and reveals its theme to us, this idea that all Americans work together to create harmony and to create the American song, which is an American value that's reflected through the motto on the United States seal, E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many, one. So when we look at a poem on the page, it can tell us a lot. One other thing that I want to point out that's really important when you're analyzing poetry is to remember that a thought may not end at the end of the line. And the sentence may not necessarily end at the end of the line. The thought and the sentence might continue on into the next line and into the next. And it may be, as in the case of Whitman's poem, one long single sentence, right? So don't necessarily think that the line break is where that thought is breaking. So as you are explicating, fancy word for explaining, your poem for paper 2, ask yourself the following questions about its internal structure. Does the poem seem to divide itself up naturally into internal parts? If so, where and why? What are the major shifts in the poem, if there are any? Is it shifting in tone, maybe from happy to sad? Is it shifting in tense, maybe from past to present or vice versa? Or maybe in voice, from first person to third person? Is it shifting in subject matter or topic? And how is each part of the poem kind of building on the parts that came before it? And how do they all combine into some sort of meaningful sense of wholeness? So if the poem doesn't seem to divide up into natural parts that are evident to you, what do you think its organizing principles might be? Internal structure gives you yet another element to write about in paper 2. So in paper 2, you might have a whole paragraph devoted to setting. Maybe, maybe a whole paragraph devoted to the speaker. Maybe a paragraph devoted to internal structure. Maybe one devoted to external structure, which is what we're going to look at next week. And of course, you're constantly connecting to theme, the main idea of the poem. So that's the internal structure in poetry document, and you're going to work with that in this week's discussion board, where we're going to consider the internal structures of the poems that we're reading for this week. The other document that I want to review with you in this video is quoting from poetry. And so again, to get to it, you'll go to content, you'll go to course documents, and then you'll look for quoting from poetry. And you'll have to hit load more, which is what I'm doing right now, in order to get to it. So I said before in a previous video that when you're incorporating quotes into your paper that are from a poem, the rules of the game are a little bit different than when you're using a quote from prose. And the main difference is that you're not going to list the page number. The reason being that most poems are shorter works, and they usually appear maybe just on one page. So rather than citing with a page number in your in-text or parenthetical citation in parentheses after the quote, you'll be citing with the line number. And so that's the main convention that's just a little bit different. But I give you on this document examples that illustrate the correct way to incorporate quotes from poetry into your writing in paper 2. So you want to notice the rules that they're illustrating. You want to follow those rules in your own writing. First off, be selective. So choose only the most effective phrases from your poem to quote. You need to always be connecting the quote into your own thesis and your own ideas. You're not just pulling a quote from out of thin air just to put it into the paper, right? You need to have a reason for placing it there. You want to integrate the quote smoothly and grammatically into your own sentence structure. And you'll be using those diagonal marks to indicate the line divisions when you're quoting up to 3 lines at one time. You'll leave one space on either side of that diagonal mark. So you'll have the first line, space, diagonal space, second line, space, diagonal space, third line, space, right? That's the way that you would do it. Now, if you're quoting more than 3 lines, you want to create a block quote. And we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. You're going to reproduce the lines the way they look in the original, on the original page. You will not run them together with the diagonals in a block quote. It's different. And then you want to keep those long block quotes to a minimum, because like any device in writing, they're going to lose their effectiveness, their oomph, if you overuse them. So short phrases and clauses are almost always more effective, and you reserve those long block quotes for a powerful passage maybe. And then again, you cite line numbers, not page numbers, in your parenthetical citations. So here are some examples of those rules on the sheet. In spite of all the things which the speaker admits love cannot do, she explains that, quote, many a man is making friends with death, unquote, precisely because he does not have love in his life. So notice how this phrase from the poem, many a man is making friends with death, is incorporated into the writer's own sentence structure very smoothly, right? And notice that the line number 7 is in parentheses. Now, there's only one issue here, and this sheet actually comes from the department. I did not create the examples on the sheet. But if this is the first time that you're quoting from this poem in a paragraph, you would need the author's last name inside that parenthetical citation before the line number. So the author's last name, no comma, the line number 7, end parentheses, and then your period. Your period does not come after the word life there. It comes after the last parenthesis mark, because that is now the end of your sentence. Here's a second example. Shakespeare presents a humorous but touching example of true love with his speaker's devotion to his mistress in spite of her imperfections, such as her reeking breath and the, quote, black wires that grow on her head, unquote. This is kind of a fun poem from Shakespeare, by the way, if you never read it. And then parentheses, 8, comma 4, end parentheses, period. So the quote is very short. It's just black wires that grow on her head. And that quote is integrated very smoothly into the writer's own sentence structure. Why do you think the word that is placed in brackets? The brackets indicate that that one word has been changed from what originally appeared in the poem. It's been changed or it's been added, right? And so this writer added the word that, or changed the original wording, so that the quote would fit smoothly in with his or her sentence structure. So that's when you're using those brackets inside a quote. If you have to bracket more than just 1 or 2 words, then you might just want to paraphrase, put the quote into your own words. And notice that there is a comma between 8 and 4. And that's because first the writer quotes black wires. That's from line 8. And secondly, grow on her head from line 4, probably. So we've got a comma to separate them. So you see that the order in which you give the quotes, if you're quoting from 2 separate sections of a poem, you would do the in-text citation in that same order with the line numbers. And the reason there's a comma is because you have line 8 and then you have line 4. So that comma separates the 2 line numbers. We don't have to put Shakespeare's name in our in-text citation because we already said his name in our attribution, in our sentence. Number 3, by referring to, quote, the road all runners come, unquote, and then you have 5, the line number, Hausman broadens his theme to include all human beings as they make their way through life. So again, we work the phrase, a short little phrase from the poem, into our sentence structure. We put the line number, in this case, just after the quote. You could put it there, or you could place it at the end of the sentence. We don't have to use Hausman's name in the in-text citation because we're using his name in our sentence. Number 4, because the athlete dies before anyone has broken his record, the world will never consider him one of those, quote, runners whom renown outran, unquote. And in this instance, this is also by Hausman. So if you're writing about Hausman and he's the only, this piece from Hausman, this poem, is the only piece that you're writing about in a paragraph, then you would not have to use his name again in the successive quotes after the first one. But if you switch over to another poem, then you have to give us the writer's name. Otherwise, we get confused about where the source is coming from. Does that make sense? The Duke's pride, not his heart, is offended by his last Duchess's tendency to treat everyone with friendliness and courtesy, comma, quote, as if she ranked, space, diagonal, space, his, bracketed, gift of a 900 years old name, space, diagonal, space, with anybody's gift, unquote. And then in parentheses, 32 through 34. So we've got 3 lines being quoted, and therefore, since we're doing that, we have to have the space, diagonal space, between those lines. And the reason that his is bracketed is because, again, that word was changed from the original poem to make it fit in with the writer's sentence structure. And the reason that you can put that dash is because you're doing lines 32, 33, and 34. So you could do 32-34, or you could do it this way, 32, comma, 33, comma, 34, last parenthesis, period. Number 6, wanting all her attention focused on himself, the Duke resents his wife for having a heart, quote, too soon made glad, unquote, by the simple pleasures of life. And then 7, the speaker thinks for himself and realizes this particular wall is unnecessary to keep peace between the neighbors, colon. And then you have the quotes from the 3 lines with the spaces and diagonals and spaces separating them. This piece is from Frost Mending Wall. So ideally you should have Frost 24-26 in your in-text citation there. So why can you use that colon? Why should you use that instead of a comma after the word neighbors? It's because your sentence before the quote is a complete sentence. It's an independent clause. It's not just part of a sentence. It's not a dependent clause. If it's a dependent clause, you'd use a comma, right? But because it's a complete sentence within itself there before the quote, you can use a colon. Now, what would happen if that colon had been a period? Yikes, you would have a dropped quote. Because if that colon had been a period, then that quote is going to appear as a sentence all by itself. And remember that golden rule? Anytime a sentence appears all by itself in your writing, or I'm sorry, a quote appears all by itself as a sentence in your writing, it's dropped. You've got to incorporate it into your own sentence structure. And then number 8 is an example of also using the colon, and we can do it because that sentence before the quote, again, is a complete sentence. It's an independent clause. But this time we've blocked the quote. So notice the conventions of a blocked quote. So in poetry, in order to block a quote, it needs to be more than 3 lines. If it's more than 4 lines in prose, you would block it. And so the conventions are that the entire quote is set apart 10 spaces from the left margin, right? And notice that there are dots there, and it looks like the department made an error. There should only be 3. That's called an ellipsis, 3 dots. And not long ago, I was observing an adjunct instructor, and evaluating her class and her teaching, and she did very well, by the way, at a different campus. And she asked her students, do you know what an ellipsis is? And one of them raised his hand and he said, I believe that's a venereal disease. So it's not a venereal disease. It sounds like it might be, but it's actually not. It actually refers to 3 dots. And I think I really need to take this document and correct some of the boo-boos that are in it. But that is a boo-boo. Should just be the 3 dots. Because the first part of that line, before I see him there, has been left out. That's why we have the 3 dots. Notice that there are no quotation marks around this quote. Now, if this was anything other than a block quote, you'd receive serious point deductions for that. And you could even be accused of plagiarizing if you didn't put the quotation marks around the direct wording from the writer. But block quotes say that you don't have to do that. And the rationale that MLA has behind that is because you've indented that whole thing over and blocked it 10 spaces from the margin, your reader knows that's a quote. So you don't have to put the quotation marks. I know, it's kind of dumb, right? Sometimes I think MLA just kind of messes with us a little bit to make our lives a little bit harder. I don't know. Just saying. Don't tell anybody I said that. And also notice the other big time change that MLA suddenly makes with a block quote. Notice that the period at the end of this quote does not come after the last parenthesis. Remember how we've drilled it into your head that always, always, always when you quote on your paper, the period now comes after your last parenthesis? Well, that's true for everything except a block quote. And in a block quote, it comes at the end of the quote. So in this case, right after the word saying, and there is no period after the in-text citation. Why? Again, I think they're messing with you. I think they're just making you want to pull out all your hair and have a panic attack. But it's okay. It's okay. You'll get it. So this week's readings, we have The Changeling by Judith Ortiz Cofer, The Facebook Sonnet by Sherman Alexie, Native American poet. We have Internal Structure in Poetry, which I talked about in this video. And then we have Church Going by Philip Larkin, Vultures by Chinua Achebe, and Ruins by Adonis. And we're going to consider the internal structure in those poems in this week's discussion board topic. So thanks for your patience. Have a good week, everybody. I will see you in next week's video.